On the first day of Christmas, Santa was up early, making sure everything would be ready for Christmas on time. He had a list of wishes from children from all over the world, and he knew that from this moment, the list would just keep getting longer. Ho, 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 Santa thought to himself. We are going to be one busy Christmas workshop. And he immediately began looking around for extra support to meet the demands of the enormous list of wishes. Santa had already made sure that raw materials no longer had to come from planet Earth. A younger generation of toy makers like top engineer Penelope had been pushing middle management for years, trying to open their eyes on what you could do with new technology. You didn't have to produce on Earth. You could produce on a spaceship. So they built the Juliana. And while you would be traveling out there in space, you didn't have to risk your life in dangerous situations. You could make a little friendly CO2 neutral welfare robot who could keep you company and help you out. Spending most of the year in deep space got a bit too lonely though, especially for the younger generation. They wanted an extra ship. The budget was limited though. So the council decided to produce 6 more welfare robots and rent them out to various charity organizations back on Earth. And with their support, the workshop was then able to build a fully automated, identical sister ship, the Kalinka. And now the kids could leave the Juliana and go back to Earth whenever they wanted. In order to complete the deal, the first robot Penelope ever built had to become part of the new agreement with the charity organizations. Her name was Kaya, and Penelope saw Kaya as a real friend. Nobody quite understood their relationship, but in fear of what would happen to Penelope, nobody dared to delete Kaya's memories. So Kaya, who was always in a good mood, was shipped away to the charity organizations, with all of her memories of Penelope intact. Penelope herself was devastated by the loss. She returned to the base at the North Pole, where she would be sleeping for longer and longer and didn't talk much to anyone. And the radio staff noticed how the once great inventor was now as lively as a dead fish, and that when she was awake, she would be working on mysterious robot projects that she wouldn't be telling anyone about. So, on this first day of Christmas, with Penelope sound asleep at the North Pole station, Santa hesitated to start up the Kalinka, because he didn't want to wake her up. But he needed the support from the sister ship, and there was no quiet way of getting it into orbit. If Penelope wasn't over her loss of Kaya, it would be a very insensitive thing to do, starting up huge spaceship engines right outside of her window. On the other hand, if she was strong enough by now, perhaps it was time to wish her good luck and give her a chance to make her next move. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the second day of Christmas, the 7 welfare robots were gathered and ready for their first annual checkup. They'd arrived from 7 different destinations, and they were now headed for a Scandinavian town a little further up north. 2 programmers from the workshop were already waiting for them up there. The 7 welfare robots had seen pictures of each other, but they'd never met. Their individual citizenships had been granted to them in secret. Without any trouble, their 7 legal passports had been passing successfully through airport security, and the robots themselves had gotten through very quiet metal detectors. But they had also been told that they would not be meeting each other. Not before they reached their final destination. And now, due to a few flight delays, here they were, in the very same terminal, at the very same time, waiting to catch their final plane. and none of them believed that this was a coincidence. The two programmers had already arrived at the Scandinavian destination, and they were looking forward to receive the 7 welfare robots in the evening. The house was quite old. It used to belong to Santa, and stood on the ice for many years at the North Pole, until the ice began to melt, and they had to move the house somewhere else. It had a small lab in the basement where the kids from the workshop used to experiment with building little space rockets, hoping to one day visit Santa in space. Later, the Kalinka of course solved that problem, but she wasn't built at the time. And the town nearby wasn't any metropole, but it was very cozy. It had water and a forest nearby, and it was big enough to test the social skills of the 7 welfare robots to see if any annual updates would now be needed. When the robots were delayed in the airport once again, they simply decided to start doing what everybody else seemed to be doing at the international terminal: shop and talk about it. The two programmers, Rebecca and Jill, were ready to pick them up at the local airport, and they knew about the flight delays, but there wasn't much they could do. It wasn't before 2 of the welfare robots, Casper and Camille, experienced a simultaneous out-of-the-blue shutdown that Rebecca and Jill at the Red House started having similar thoughts. Perhaps it wasn't all a coincidence. At least there had to be a technical explanation. They got hold of Penelope at the North Pole station, and she wasn't too happy with being disturbed, but she was the core programmer, and the only one who could read code fast enough to figure out what might have gone wrong. Penelope therefore left everything else she was working on right on her desk and ran out into the landing field to catch a Dash 7 4-propeller, which had just arrived, with piles of letters for Santa. And of course the 7 welfare robots had an emergency procedure. They were designed to support people and could easily take care of themselves. But they were also getting quite fond of their individual lives. They valued their freedoms, and they worried now that the shutdown of Casper and Camille would end up keeping them all at the Red House forever. On the 3rd day of Christmas, Penelope arrived in the Red House. Rebecca and Jill were more than happy to see her. In the night, Kaya would of course also be coming back, but Rebecca and Jill didn't know if Penelope thought that that was a good thing, so they didn't mention it and made sure everything else would be working. "We've made a room ready for you upstairs. We've got your favorite food, and you can stay as long as you want." Like many other children who'd grown up in the workshop, Penelope was an orphan, and Rebecca and Jill never had any children. So from time to time, they'd borrow Penelope a little, whenever they could, and whenever she wasn't too busy out there, growing up and everything. Penelope went down into the cold basement lab, not knowing what to expect of it now. She hadn't been using it for quite a while, and the house was no longer the only place in the world you could stay if you wanted to see other people and start a new life after growing up in the workshop. She managed to get the power back on and went through some of Rebecca and Jill's old video clips from way back when the welfare robot project was brand new. And she tried to figure out what on earth you had to do in order to get 2 of them to shut down at the exact same time. If you'd ever be able to rule out the intervenience of a third party, you'd then have to figure out which of the 2 welfare robots send out the signal first. And then, if you were lucky, you could figure out why the other robot had been receiving the signal. A couple of 100 years of hard work right there in front of you. If you really wanted to know, you probably could. Funny how they were all be coming back now, Penelope thought to herself. Living here in the same house as you. And Kaya, the friend you would always be needing. quite an absurd situation if you really had to make yourself so vulnerable that you would be considered worthy of having such a marvelous friend by your side. Everybody else would be thinking that you were surely way too strong to be needing any of that. So, someone else's property now, the way it should be. Rebecca and Jill got ready to drive to the local airport to pick up Kaya and the other robots. They strongly advised Penelope to stay in the house, because they'd both felt a slight change in the mood of the robots, who'd been sending them little sarcastic messages. Rebecca and Jill explained how the robots were all nervous now. They worried that the 2 battery failures with Casper and Camille would keep all of them stuck in the lab forever. "I'm not sure if it's a battery failure," said Penelope, "but I'll do my best." She chose to stay in the house anyway, though. "And by the way," said Rebecca, "don't go outside in the garden." Earlier that night, Rebecca and Jill had been sitting out in the conservatory, and they were convinced that a very large bird, or something quite heavy, had been moving around up in the trees. You couldn't quite see what it was, but there was something in those trees. Something much heavier than any winter bird you could think of. Until we figure that out, do not go into the garden, sweetheart. See you later. On the 4th day of Christmas, the 7 welfare robots arrived in the local airport, and so did their luggage. Their luggage now contained 2 of their own. "Hello everybody, my name is Jill. Welcome to the annual checkup. On behalf of the Juliana crew, I have to say that we are, of course, terribly sorry about your accident at the international terminal, but of course we all knew from the beginning that at some point you guys would be needing a few updates. The chef robot, Svea, designed to cook gourmet food under extreme conditions, pointed out on behalf of the group that it was of course very interesting to spend time with others who were like yourself. But everybody had their individual lives now, and they were all hoping that the Christmas checkup wouldn't be lasting longer than necessary. We've called in our best engineer," said Jill, "and we've got an entire town available in which we can do live monitoring while you are interacting with people and then make adjustments as we go. We are not going to be burying ourselves in kilometers of code. My colleague Rebecca here, our top engineer Penelope, and myself are also looking forward to returning home as soon as possible. So let's get going." The welfare robots had many questions in regard to their personal integrity. Petrina had been designed to work in dangerous cargo docks, and she wanted to stay loyal to the crew back home. "Everything I've seen and heard and thought for an entire year, is that all being stored somewhere?" "We are recording everything, actually," said Jill. "And you have access to all of it, first you and then others. But only the parts you allow others to see." "Fair enough," said Svea. "We are not spies," said Jill. "We are a charity organization. We shall also continue to leave it up to you to decide how many people should know." "That we are machines?" asked Sally. "Yeah," said Jill. Sally explained that as a maritime rescue robot, you had to let the team know. Otherwise, she said, your colleagues would be putting themselves in danger, trying to make sure you were safe in situations where it wasn't needed at all. "Same here," said Kaya. "Would you like an oil change?" A kid in a wheelchair asked me that once. He was joking, of course. Kaya was working with kids her own age, who had physical disabilities. Once they knew what she was, it became easier for them to find more friends. "How about you, Svea?" asked Jill. Svea explained that of course the organization people knew, but the other chefs didn't. And Werner, he was working with an age group who grew up with steam trains. Some of them now had trouble imagining how the entire main library in Edinburgh, for instance, could be stored inside the tip of a fingernail. He didn't like the idea that a single robot like him should keep these people company during their last moments on this planet. But very often, he was all they had, so he never told them what he was. Penelope knew very well what Kaja was. The two managed to continue conversation. Svea threw everybody out of the kitchen and started cooking, while the two boxes containing Camille and Casper were lowered into the basement of the Red House. They love each other, said Kaja. If we are doing a reboot of both of them, we have to be very careful. Sure, said Penelope. But if we just skip reconstruction, they'll both turn into zombies. You are aware of that, right? I am, said Kaja. But they'll recover. You can't just run a big fat eraser over everything that they had together. All right, we'll try it, said Penelope. Yeah, said Kaja. It's all about love or nothing. On the 5th day of Christmas, Jill and Rebecca had gotten in contact with the Juliana crew. They were both happy to announce how all 7 welfare robots had arrived and that they were functional. Casper and Camille still didn't look too good. They were wandering around in the house like 2 ghosts. And of course, by Christmas, all 7 welfare robots had to be at least fully functional. Penelope had confirmed that it was technically possible to just erase the memory of Casper and Camille from when they first met at the International Airport Terminal and let the 2 lovebirds live in a world where they'd never met before. In fact, it was quite easy to do, but Penelope just wasn't going to do it, and she was the only one who knew how. So now, Kaja and Penelope had gone downtown. They'd found the arcade, a cozy place with a lot of old pinball machines, and they were planning on hanging out there all day, play pinball, and drink cherry sodas. They gave a flying sugar pie about what the administration thought of them now. If you began erasing very private and joyful memories of 2 welfare robots, how would any of the others ever be able to trust you again? You could start a war. Camille ended up in the kitchen. They didn't know each other well, but back at the airport terminal, Svea had definitely seen a completely different Camille, and she knew why Camille had been built in the first place. When youngsters from many different corners of the world had to study together and feel included at school, Camille was there, making sure you made use of your time and the folks around you, no matter who you were and what you came from. And as Kaja had predicted, all 7 welfare robots were capable of recovering by learning from each other. All you had to do was give them some time and they would figure out a way. Kaja already knew that the group was strong that way. Casper had been working with guys in their mid-20s in fast-track environments where material goods and competition often mattered more than family and friends. In some countries, the habits and comfort levels had gotten so high and seductive that it had a negative impact on the national economy itself. Now he couldn't remember any of it, but there was a chance that he would be going to very soon. Later in the evening, the arcade opened up a small alcohol-free dance floor, and Penelope felt that Kaja was keen on staying. Kaja didn't feel that she needed any updates. She was quite satisfied with her abilities, except dancing. She explained to Penelope how she was trying to get better at dancing. I watch video clips, she said, but I end up moving exactly like the people in the video clips. Penelope laughed because she didn't see herself as being much of a dance teacher, but she promised Kaja that she would do her best. After having tried a couple of times, Kaja felt more sure of her moves, and she was curious to find out more. And so was Martin, a young man who was working at the arcade. He was very curious to find out more, especially about that blonde girl. The 2 owners quickly noticed, because in the evening Martin would always be busy playing the old pinball machines. And now, he didn't seem to be in too much of a hurry. On the 6th day of Christmas, Jill and Rebecca had found 4 places in town where you could secretly deploy the welfare robots. As the robots were interpreting the world around them, they'd be generating an awful lot of code. From the code, you could tell what was going on inside of them. And if there were any abnormalities, you could figure out from watching the code what the problem was. Fatal mistakes were very rare, and in most cases you'd just be fine-tuning a bit of vision and a few details involving language, but only with the consent of the robot, and you weren't allowed to read any code until it let you. And the robot would ultimately be deciding what was a mistake and what wasn't. You also had to be on your toes, because the robots were writing their own code extremely fast, and sometimes the problem would be hiding like a needle in a haystack. During the day, Penelope, Jill, and Rebecca would have to be standing by, ready to monitor live, as the robots would be interacting with the world. Suitable locations would therefore be little local environments nearby, and preferably nothing too crowded and chaotic, at least not in the beginning. The location also needed to resemble their everyday environment. Sally would be needing access to plenty of water. Petrine would need to be handling real cargo somewhere. Casper would need to be discussing real business plans with someone. And for those who work with events and social activities, you would need a place in which you could find citizens of all ages, working on a volunteer basis. Something open and yet secluded. Preferably something that would contain a restaurant kitchen as well. It was called the NICOLAI complex, and the name referred to an old saint. But Nikolai was also one of many code names that Santa would be using. Especially fundraisers on Earth found it more practical. In an open letter to a government or an organization, you could include Santa much easier if you had a few alternative names to choose from. And Santa had many. Are the locations so close to each other, he asked, that the welfare robots can go and visit each other during the day if they want to? Yes, Rebecca and Jill confirmed that they were. And now that Camille and Casper seemed to be recovering so well, Kaya and Penelope had promised that they would of course be joining and supporting the checkup from tomorrow morning. The girls weren't in the house though. The day before, they'd gotten home late, and for breakfast they'd been around. After that, they disappeared again. They said something about visiting the arcade in order to beat a high score on a pinball machine. Apparently it was going the right way, even though they hadn't succeeded yet. Which also meant that it couldn't be Kaya playing the machine. It wouldn't be much of a challenge to her. So what was she doing while Penelope was playing? And why was Penelope suddenly so interested in playing pinball? On the 7th day of Christmas, Jill and Rebecca took the 7 welfare robots downtown to the NICOLAI complex. They were happy that the live experiment could finally begin. "You are in control of your own online connections," said Jill, "directly to the Red House. And you can switch them on and off whenever you like. When you're online, we are monitoring your voices, your view, your moves, and your emotions. And you are free to cut us off whenever you please. Just remember that the more you give us, the better chance we have of helping you guys out and optimizing you, if you so desire, before we send you back. We will see you back at the Red House, no later than midnight." Penelope was in the house, curious to see who was going online first. The welfare robots would now be leaving one by one, but they weren't going online right away. Sally went to the swimming resort, Kaya and Camille went to the culture house for youngsters, Petrina went to the loading docks at the mall, and Casper went to a hotel lobby downtown. Svea had to wait for the chefs to arrive at the restaurant, and Werner was waiting for the local archive to open up. "Sweetheart Penelope, if you are back at the house, listen up," said Svea. "There's a casino outside of town. Maybe Werner and I should go out there and bet the entire organization budget for next year and smoke big cigars. What do you say, Werner? Of course, the welfare robots weren't going to share every little incident occurring during the day just to give you the insight. No. Penelope knew that. Rebecca had a suspicion, and Jill was hoping it wasn't true. Penelope registered that the vocal sounds were coming through to the house just fine. The mistakes were there, but it wasn't anything too dramatic. A pink flare blocking Svea's view whenever she got close to certain heated metals, a pressure valve in Sally's left foot that wasn't always fully functional. And Casper, who would often forget little things during the day, as he said. But Jill wasn't quite sure if that was a technical mistake. It could be something else. He'd been preparing a small business conference at the local hotel by the railway station. How Your Kids See Your Business. Ask yourself, why? By Casper P. Jennings. He was writing a book too that you could pre-order and put under your Christmas tree. Werner was welcomed in the archive. He was just the kind of guy the other volunteers had been looking for, and he quickly got involved in arranging a couple of excursions in the local winter forest outside of town. At the Culture House, Kaya and Camille met up with the volunteers who were running the projector at the art cinema next to the restaurant. And they were invited to become part of the team of online gamers at the Culture House. They could have revealed that their response time in computer games was of course much quicker than that of a human. But like the others, Kaya and Camille were there to interact with people and to be treated as real human beings. If you just told everybody what you were, the data collected from the live experiment would be useless. And if you made any new friends, you would just have to tell them what you were later. On the 8th day of Christmas, the 7 welfare robots were beginning to get more involved with people around town. They were liked wherever they went, and they wanted to keep it that way. So they discussed their manners and talked openly with each other about their individual obstacles. They also refused to let themselves be transported by Rebecca and Jill. They didn't need any help, and believed that they could get to work on their own just fine. Casper had big plans for the town, and he told Camille all about them many times, as often as he could. The loading dock workers loved Petrine because she kept the team together and put her back into it. In the swimming resort, Sally had been teaching the lifesavers a couple of very effective diving techniques, and today they were all looking forward to see her again. At the NICOLAI complex, Svea was rolling with the boys in the restaurant, who now considered her one of their own. Camille was helping out in the art cinema nearby, and Kaya hung out with the gamers in the Culture House, while Werner was helping out getting an exhibition ready at the archive of old hunting horns. At the hotel, Casper now had to show up for a second round of How Your Kids See Your Business. The morning report from the Juliana had not yet gotten through to the Red House, though, and when Jill attempted to make contact with the onboard computer, it got her name wrong. She called up the Antarctica Traffic Control, who told her that they had a midnight report from the Juliana stating that it was changing its course because it had found a planet worth investigating. Suitable planet containing a possibility for raw materials has been found, altering coordinates. Jill was excited, and the whole thing made sense now. Whenever the Juliana changed its course, there was always a risk that the signal got scrambled for a while. No big deal. And exciting news, too, to share with Rebecca.
That's a good thing.
During the day, the welfare robots were fairly quiet. There weren't any malfunctions to report anymore. The only one who was kind enough to shed some light on their future plans was Petrine. She'd been invited by her colleagues at the loading dock to go to a party the next day. During the party, she was going to be staying offline the entire time. and she would be coming home late. Sally would be going to that party too. She would also be staying offline, and there would probably be some alcohol involved. Jill took notes of that and grabbed another cookie, because there was nothing else she could do. You couldn't keep the welfare robots from exploring the effects of alcohol, and they were sensitive to it. Penelope had made sure that the robot would be affected and could experience a more courageous behavior, slowed down reaction time, and the ability to access emotional memories. And there wasn't any way in which you could really study this. Even if you asked Petrina and Sally to stay online during the entire party and gathered all the code from just one night out, you could be spending an entire year trying to read it, and another year trying to understand it. If you got 2 or more robots drunk at the same time, in the same place, nobody knew what would happen. In the end, you would be making yourself more useful trying to get the Christmas presents out on time. On the 9th day of Christmas, Sally stayed in the swimming resort until late afternoon. Petrina came over on a surprise visit to see if Sally was ready to go to the party in the evening, and tell her that for the rest of the day it might not be necessary to go back to the Red House at all. They already had each other and everything they needed. Casper stopped by just to let the girls know that if he had the time, he'd be joining them later in the evening. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he would be going to the Barcelona Cocktail Club downtown. So, in the evening, the Red House finally got a report directly from space. Somewhere out there, the Juliana spaceship would be landing soon on the newly discovered planet. The planet had an atmosphere very similar to that of Earth. It was good news. So good you wished you could get in contact with the very quiet welfare robots like Sally and Petrina. Things were going in the right direction, but they were already offline and had been given permission to stay offline. Kaya was supposed to return from the esport room at the Culture House, but she and Penelope were having a lot of fun, secretly working together online, beating up the local gamers in the esport room at the Culture House, who had no idea what they were up against, Martin included. Svea was still in the restaurant, closing down the kitchen and cooking a small dish for Camille, who was running the projector in the art cinema next door. Casper had just arrived from the disco looking for Camille, and Werner was closing down the archive for the day. A very loud sound suddenly shook the Red House. It was coming from the town river, and almost everybody in town heard it. It looked as if the Juliana had crash-landed. But Penelope noticed that it couldn't be the Juliana, because it had no catering modules. If it was anything, it was the Kalinka, the sister ship. The Kalinka had no crew. It was completely run by software. Besides, there was no way that Santa and the Juliana could have made a mistake like this. The newly discovered planet was obviously Earth, and the Kalinka was probably happy and proud that she'd found it. She wants to surprise us and make us feel that she's as important as her big sister. That's what's going on here, said Penelope. And it's very sweet. But it's also a super dangerous malfunction, because she will do anything now to carry through with obtaining raw materials from here and keep production going at all costs. She's always a step behind the Juliana, and sometimes sad, I think, that nobody volunteers to stay on board. She's a nice ship, but right now, she's envious. She's angry. If you go out there now and try to negotiate, she'll rip your arms off. If I was you, I'd ask Agent D to get in contact with the local authorities here and clear the area by the river. And then I'd be sending Petrina and Sally out there. They are both rescue robots, and they are both designed to withstand super high physical pressure.
Yes, sir.
She can't do much damage to them. It all sounded like a good plan, but Sally and Petrina were nowhere to be found. They'd gotten too drunk to register anyone trying to get through, and every time they picked up a sound, of a familiar voice asking where they were. They always seemed to be occupied with something else, even though they could hardly remember their own names.
I'm hearing voices inside of my head.
It's the red house. They're organizing something.
On the 10th day of Christmas, Kaya persuaded Martin to stay in the e-sport room in the culture house and told him everything about robots and spaceships. He then got a staff member from the arcade to call up his parents and confirm that he was safe. Sally and Petrina had to get to the ship fast, and nobody knew their way around town, like Martin did. Camille suggested that Svea should make some pancakes for Martin, to make him stay in the room. Everybody expected Martin to be running away screaming at any point, and Kaya kept her mouth shut about the fact that Penelope liked him a little bit. Now they had a spaceship to save, and everybody at the Red House had given up trying to make contact with the two very drunk heroes downtown. No matter how much you kept yelling and screaming, you just couldn't get through. But Martin had a different approach. He addressed them in his own calm way without being stressful and explained to them why they were needed. Petrina and Sally had never heard Martin's voice before, and they thought he was an angel, calling them up to participate in a very important secret rescue mission, which wasn't entirely untrue. Petrina and Sally got almost every detail wrong about Martin, but they got up, and he managed to point them in the right direction. Guided by Martin, who knew every little passageway in the local labyrinth, they went over train tracks, through holes in fences, and through the dark forest by the river. But Petrina was still too weak to even stand. Sally wasn't getting aboard the Kalinka on her own, and decided to fix the problem. "You'll now be witnessing the rinsing of a tummy filter," she said. She got hold of a toolbox from two sailors and proceeded to cut Petrina open, as she carefully explained what she was doing. "You can take this, Martin. You're one of us now," she said. She took out the filter, rinsed it in the freezing waters of the cold local town river, and put it back inside Petrina. Petrina got up still a bit dizzy, but able to keep her balance, and quick on her feet. And Martin probably got to see a little more than he could handle that night, but he stayed in the room. And Petrina and Sally got to the Kalinka on time. The Kalinka wasn't interested in receiving any visitors, especially not welfare robots, who would come around and push her out of her little ray of sunshine and tell her what to do. She was going to gather raw materials. Penelope was fighting at the Red House, trying to reach the mainframe and save the town from being attacked by all kinds of automated interstellar digging machines, released by the enormous Kalinka. Her engines were terribly damaged from the crash. Even if you convinced her to take off, the ship wouldn't be able to lift itself. But Sally discovered that there was a large dropship on board, and it was still intact. Sally and Petrina finally got Kalinka in the air. Kaya returned home from the culture house, and Petrina jumped from the ship, hoping that Sally would soon be following her. She went down through the roof of the Red House and all the way down into the basement. She'd gotten a few scratches, but she was all in one piece. And so was Sally, the dropship, and the Kalinka. On the 11th day of Christmas, Sally had gotten Kalinka through the atmosphere. She was trying to carefully unhook the towing cables. The wrecked engines on the Kalinka had now stopped completely, and the huge structure seemed dead silent. There didn't seem to be too much of a fight left in her. Sally did everything she could to avoid flying too close to her, though. Martin was still in the culture house, and had been following Sally's journey for quite a while. Camille had been staying, keeping him company, and making sure he didn't accidentally take any pictures. She'd also been thanking him for his support, and told him that this was, for better or worse, how the organization often met new people, and that without his help, the Kalinka crash landing could have gone much worse. Sally let go of the Kalinka and headed back through the atmosphere. The dropship had a more ordinary-looking flying machine inside of it, one you could land on Earth without creating too much attention.
Okay, Sally, I'm gonna walk you through how to start this. I need you to look down the left.
Sally wasn't quite sure how to fly it, but she had Agent D who would guide her through, step by step. He would also make sure she could land it in the local airport.
This will be a very easy ride for you. Good luck.
Thank you for the help.
Penelope was in the attic, trying to get hold of the North Pole Traffic Control Center. She had unfinished work sitting on her desk back at the base, and she asked the staff members if they would be so kind to send it to the Red House. She didn't know how long she'd be staying, and there didn't seem to be any chance that she'd be able to finish it before Christmas. But at least she'd have access to it. It was an unfinished robot. It was all in one piece, and it ought to be sitting right there on her desk. It shouldn't be hard to find, she told them. In the basement of the Red House, Jill and Rebecca were getting ready to go downtown and remove the last traces of the Kalinka crash landing. Most of the downtown area had now been evacuated, but a bunch of smaller industrial robots released by the Kalinka were still running loose, looking for raw materials and awaiting her orders. The hardware was valuable and had to be kept for reuse. Shooting down the robots with conventional weapons would cause too much damage. You also had to be very precise, and the task could only be carried out by authorized and experienced personnel, basically because you would be shooting at something that couldn't defend itself. And at the time, there was no other way of fixing it. In the attic, the North Pole Traffic Control kindly answered Penelope back that her unfinished welfare robot was gone. In fact, most of the staff honestly believed she had already taken it with her, because it had been gone ever since she left. Penelope thanked them for the information and rushed down to the basement to get hold of Jill and Rebecca. She quickly wrote them a list over little parts she would be needing, because now there would actually be a chance of her finishing the robot on time, and she had a good feeling of where to find it. Jill and Rebecca took the list with them downtown and began dismantling the lost industrial robots left behind by the Kalinka. On the 12th day of Christmas, everybody in the house had been looking around for Penelope's half-finished robot from the North Pole. They'd been looking everywhere, in trees and bushes, and they found a lot of nice cats, some winter birds, and a single mailman, but no robot. Kaya had been listening and listening while Penelope had described in detail how it worked and where she believed you could find it. But she still couldn't understand why it had been following her. Kaya was such a good friend, and there were many things the two could do together. Penelope sometimes thought that if every person on the planet had a friend like Kaya, Earth would be a much happier place. In fact, all 7 welfare robots had been quite supportive, and they'd been handling the Kalinka accident very well, so well that it was tempting to make copies of them. They supported each other well and interacted easily with human beings. But of course Kaya would have to live with the fact that she wouldn't be the only one of her kind. Kaya wasn't a big fan of the idea. Neither was Werner. Casper and Werner were waiting in the airport for Sally to arrive, and Casper and Penelope was on the same page when it came to making copies. "Why not try it?" said Casper. "The Kalinka accident would have been impossible if you'd had 7 welfare robots like us aboard. They could probably get you into all kinds of trouble, but they would never crash land the entire ship because of a couple of computational errors. That's for sure." Casper believed that when it came to handling the hardware of the charity organization in the future, the welfare robots obviously were the future. But Werner wasn't so sure. Jill and Rebecca had gotten through the downtown area in one piece, and they'd gathered the parts that Penelope had asked for. Penelope confirmed that she now had everything she needed to complete her work on the missing welfare robot. That is, if anyone could find it. She and Kaya couldn't find it, and they believed they'd been looking everywhere. Penelope told Kaya that this robot was a gift from her to Santa. It wasn't so much the robot itself that was the gift. It was more its capability to help out others. Santa liked it when there was an opportunity for others to play music and dance, especially in the North Atlantic areas where the weather was cold, and it was important that you went out once in a while and met new people. You could hear music, you could play it yourself, or you could dance together. Santa's own foster child had often been helping out, making that happen around the North Atlantic. But after she passed away, there hadn't really been anyone around to take over that role. And Penelope had been tempted to visit Santa and explain to him that with the welfare robots you could make someone who could do kind of the same thing. She just didn't know how to tell him. She understood that he was sad over the loss of his foster child, but she didn't understand why that would prevent him from thinking in new ways. And Penelope was nervous, because if it really was such a good idea, then why hadn't Santa already done it? He was Santa, after all. It's because he's sad about it, said Kaya. But don't tell him, just go ahead and do it. That present will always be from you to him, right? And you are making it because you know that he'd appreciate what it does for the North Atlantic. And that's a pretty good present. Yeah, said Penelope. On the 13th day of Christmas, Svea was back in the restaurant in the NICOLAI complex. The downtown area was now clear and people were beginning to come back. They also seemed to be very interested in going out a bit more. Santa announced that he'd be coming back with the Juliana as soon as possible. The damaged engines on the Kalenka made it impossible for her to move out of Earth orbit. So the only chance of finishing the presents on time would be to load up the raw materials in deep space right away, get the Juliana back to Earth orbit, and connect the two ships. In order to make up for lost time, help was appreciated. A helping hand from anyone at the Red House who knew anything about toy making, welfare robots included, were now needed. There will be an unlisted plane arriving soon from the North Pole, carrying the first series of toys that we need to get done. When Santa asked how Penelope was and what she was doing, Jill and Rebecca revealed that she was making a present for him. But of course they wouldn't tell him what it was. Well, that was nice of her, said Santa. Santa didn't quite know what to say. He wasn't used to getting any presents. Among the prototypes of toys there was a doll kitchen in the first load from the North Pole. And Svea volunteered to give it a try. She'd just returned from the restaurant, and together with Kaya and Penelope she soon figured out that she would only be needing a few upgrades in order to help out. Jill and Rebecca took notes while Svea got through the kitchen design. She wasn't quite sure how good she was at playing with dolls, but sometimes in the restaurant there were kids who would bring along dolls and play with them at the table, and she'd seen that.
You want some soup? It's hot. There's not any gloves. So, the girls are burning their hands.
Later in the night, Penelope would be writing code for the new robot, hoping it would show up soon. And Kaya would be returning from a longer search in the local forest, empty-handed but still supportive of Penelope. Kaya was able to do many of the things that Svea used to do around the house. She also had a couple of ideas for the code once in a while, and Penelope would sometimes let Kaya solve some of the more tricky parts. And Kaya could do it pretty fast. Of course, this new robot project was Penelope's project. It was her gift to Santa, but maybe if she didn't mind, Penelope would be needing some help soon. It certainly would speed things up a bit. There was plenty to do now, testing and developing toys while Santa would hurry back through space in the Juliana. And there wasn't much left for Svea to do at this hour. Svea used to know Santa's foster child as well. Or at least the version of her you could hear on the radio or watch on TV. And Svea knew that she probably wasn't like that for real. But then what was she like? Not even Penelope had known Raven, and in reality it seemed only a few people did. Svea had an idea though. It seemed surprisingly easy for Svea to determine what Raven meant to her. On the 14th day of Christmas, Penelope and Kaya was back at the arcade, trying to beat the high score on the Raven and Troy pinball machine. Way back when Santa's foster child was a star, the pinball machine was among some of the most difficult machines ever built. And the fact that the arcade had one and kept it in good shape was a sign that perhaps Troy should be recreated as well. They both died in the same plane crash. And if you brought back Raven, then perhaps Troy should come along. Martin had been watching Penelope, and he wanted to ask her out, but he couldn't figure out how he was going to do that. He couldn't tell Max or Marianne about who Penelope was, or that she was a robot builder. He also couldn't tell them about the Red House. But they'd seen enough to know that she was someone important. "I like Martin, but I don't have time," said Penelope. "You never have time," said Kaya. "He's right in front of you." Penelope mentioned something about the house being on fire and Santa returning and a half-finished robot and 10,000 other things. "You are inapproachable," said Kaya. "What's he supposed to do? You drink out of 150-year-old teacups and you make welfare robots aboard spaceships. And being one of Santa's helpers, you probably live longer than other people. I mean, you're not exactly the kind of girl he would meet downtown or at school. So, he's keeping a distance. He's exactly like Raven, hanging out somewhere nearby, but never approaching." Kaya was so full of observations and ideas that Penelope decided to record some of them. If she was going to bring back Raven and Troy, they were going to need new material. And with Kaya, Penelope was able to record lyrics and capture live motion. While Kaya would be singing and dancing everything Martin had been thinking and feeling while watching Penelope in the arcade that day. Feeling very happy about something big that was about to happen, but also full of doubt. All the things Martin would say, if he could. In her own interpretation, of course. And with all the vibes running through the Red House that evening, you couldn't be anywhere in the house without hearing that someone in the basement was playing music. And they were playing loud. Camille was in the living room, and she'd never heard anything like it. She noticed how the whole house would be vibrating, but she also noticed a tapping sound underneath her chair, as if someone was hiding down there, tapping a rhythm, along with what they were playing in the basement. On the 15th day of Christmas, Penelope brought the half-finished Raven robot down into the lab in the basement. She got started on the hardware right away,
while she was trying to figure out why it had been following her. There were traces in the memory of everybody in the house, as the robot had been hiding and observing what everybody else was doing. It had been hiding in the trees outside first and later inside the house, picking up behavior and voice samples from everybody else. And it should have been so easy to just make that step forward, come out in the open and ask for help. Penelope held nothing against it, and there were plenty of nice welfare robots around who would all have been interested in helping out if they had known. And yet the internal system in the robot had concluded that hiding underneath furniture in the living room was a great solution. The batteries were working fine, but they weren't really being used. There was no initiative, and there was a long way from here and to the Raven that Penelope wanted to make and remembered. Svea had been describing her impression of Raven as a little chipper and proud being with soft moves and dark hair, often dressed in black textures, pulling her sleeves and usually hiding one eye behind a lobe of hair. Hiding, yeah, but when you saw Raven's eyes, you knew that she was definitely not hiding inside. Not like this. There was something missing. Penelope tried to address the lifeless Raven robot like you would talk simply and kindly to a dog. "Where is Troy?" asked Penelope. And that brought a little color back into the eyes of the robot. But it soon died out. Penelope tried a second time. "Hey, Ray, you know, I think Troy's coming. I'm sure he's on his way." And this time, the response was very positive. Penelope went quickly upstairs and up into the attic, where she got hold of the staff at the North Pole and asked them to send down whatever scrap and prototypes she had laying around from the construction of the 7 welfare robots. At least there ought to be a male shoulder from a fireman and some hair texture from a surfer dude, including other male parts. Robots like Petrina and Sally wasn't always designed to be girls. There were prototypes before them, and Penelope knew that there were quite a few male pieces left over from the project. "Just send everything you can find," she said. Back in the day, it was a struggle, making the welfare robots and making sure each and every one of the charity organizations got the welfare robot they needed. There were many adjustments along the way and many prototypes that never made it, but it all paid off now. And in the end, it wasn't about giving Santa a robot in a box, or 2 robots, or what they had together. It was more a question of trying to see if what they had together could inspire others. On the 16th day of Christmas, the spare parts from the North Pole arrived at the local airport, and Agent D made sure they got to the Red House safely and fast. The Troy robot was then thrown together by using pieces from prototypes of male robots, and Werner lent a hand, making sure all the parts would somehow fit together. Light as a feather and dumb as a doorknob. That was Sally's description of Troy. A surfer dude or a lifesaver living life on the beach, with not a care in the world, and light because of Raven, who was everything Troy wasn't. Sally knew guys who were like that. An instinct in Troy would give him the ability to cheer Raven up when life was too much of a challenge to her. And the dark clouds that would sometimes surround the Raven just weren't any burden to Troy. For some strange reason, they weren't dark clouds to him. Either he was too stupid to see them, or maybe he was just focused on other things. It certainly made them stronger together. Jill and Rebecca wanted to make sure that certain formalities were kept. They'd gotten a green light from Douglas Walker and Miss Box from the British record company High Rising Records, who still owned the brand. Jill and Rebecca reminded Penelope that of course Raven and Troy was still as real as the serial number on that pinball machine at the arcade. It involved other people and potentially contracts and licenses. It wasn't a toy. The two artists were officially dead, and the challenge now seemed to be that, well, apparently they weren't quite dead yet. Penelope thought about Martin, and what he might be doing at this moment. She was thinking that maybe she could invite him over for tea, and they could sit in the conservatory in the Red House and talk. She wanted to get to know him better, but at the moment, the house wasn't exactly the kind of place where you would invite someone and say, "Hey, I live here," together with 2 helpers from Santa's workshop, and what now amounted to 9 welfare robots. As if 7 wasn't enough. And by the way, this Kaya that you've already met, she's my best friend. And she also happens to be a welfare robot. Penelope concluded that in order for anyone to accept that and to take it all in, you'd need to be a Superman. Or perhaps just a very, very patient guy. Like Martin. On the 17th day of Christmas, Penelope woke up Kaya in the middle of the night. She'd been thinking about Casper and Camille in the international airport terminal, and the simultaneous shutdown that had brought her to Scandinavia and the Red House in the first place. "I figured it out," said Penelope. "Figured what out?" said Kaya. "I'm trying to lay still here with my eyes closed, so that you can be inspired to do the same and not walk around like a zombie during the daytime." "We have to try this," said Penelope. "I need your help." The Raven robot still wouldn't move, but there was something going on inside of it. And ever since Troy had been around, it had been generating an awful lot of code that looked like a song. With a little help from Kaya, Jill, and Rebecca, Penelope managed to get the song out of the Raven robot to see if it contained any of the traces she was looking for. And Jill, in the name of the workshop, had bravely volunteered to sing it. The shutdown of Casper and Camille seemed so simple now. The song would reveal an emotional state from which there seemed to be no escape. A warm and rich feeling of joy, but also a feeling of a future together that one was incapable of imagining. And even worse, the song concluded that the other part would also be incapable of imagining that future. In that way, the song would create the feeling of approaching a dead end. Like Casper and Camille falling in love in the terminal, but also realizing that there could never be a step 2 for any of them. That was exactly what Raven's song was about. And poor Jill, who didn't know Raven but recognized the subject matter, was about to fall to pieces. Raven had concluded that since Troy was always placed where he couldn't see her, he surely had no interest in her, and she would be better off on her own. It was all based on the most simple misunderstanding you could ever imagine, because Werner and Casper would always be working on Troy in a separate section of the lab, and Troy would be placed where he couldn't see Raven. And a lot of code had now been generated from that. Nevertheless, the Raven robot was doing what Penelope had programmed it to, and via the code it had written a finished piece. Penelope thought that perhaps Raven and Troy should have legs soon, so that they could move around and see each other. Yeah, that would probably be a good idea. In the morning, Kaya made sure that the subject was brought up. Would Casper ask out Camille if there was a place out there they could go? A concert, for instance, with Raven and Troy and their music, which came from a world where Camille and Casper existed. And Casper confirmed that he probably would. And all of Santa's helpers, who had nothing to gather around throughout the year, and couldn't see their own culture reflected anywhere outside of the Christmas month, they would also have a place to go. On Earth. If Raven and Troy would ever get to the point where they could play concerts, of course. Then you could show up and feel as if you were already invited. Because you knew that the two welfare robots who were performing knew about the world you came from. On the 18th day of Christmas, Marianne was out on her own downtown. Over at the arcade, she was doing all the DJing, but Martin had been offering his help recently, and she'd taken him up on the offer. It had been a while since Marianne had been out to another disco, and she was trying to appear not too interested in sound system and technical stuff. She knew the other DJs in town, and tonight they knew she was off duty. So Marianne wasn't asked to do anything that night, and that wasn't so easy for her. She knew that Max would be around, because he'd promised to take a look at the speaker system that night. Max would often lend a hand downtown and get involved in fixing things where he could. Marianne had also heard about two girls who sometimes came here in the disco, and she didn't want to appear too nosy about who they were, but tonight there were two girls at the bar who matched the description given by the other DJs, and the two girls appeared to have a good time. Nobody quite knew who they were, not even Max. But apparently these two girls had been talking to the other DJs, and they'd been recommending a beautiful quiet song that had never been played in the disco before. They'd brought it along on a USB stick that was never plugged in. It never made it into any of the laptops of the DJs, and yet all the DJs had that song on their playlist the next morning. And none of the DJs could remember how it got there. Max had heard that story too, but he didn't quite know if he believed it. The town had many musicians, and as a DJ you would often get a file from an artist who was hoping that you'd play it. At the Red House, Santa announced that the Juliana would be arriving in a couple of days, and Jill and Rebecca had prepared a number of ready solutions for the Kalinka, so that Kalinka could take over the last phase of production, once Santa and the Juliana arrived in orbit, and the two ships could be connected. Santa was hoping for the best, because he wasn't quite sure what to do about the Kalinka. He tried contacting her many times, but he wasn't so good at reading the code. He also tried to stay completely out of it, and have the two huge spaceships communicate on their own. And out of that dialogue he'd gotten a shrubbery of code. But apparently the Kalinka had the last word in the conversation between the two ships, and Santa had been puzzled about what it meant. He drew the symbols on the screen so that Jill could see them. Will be it is when over alone all I. And that's what ended the conversation between the two spaceships. It says, when it's all over, I'll be alone. That's what Kalinka is saying. Oh, said Santa. Thank you so much. On the 19th day of Christmas, Penelope connected Raven and Troy in order to see what would happen if you asked them to do a piece together. You should then be able to go right in between them and place yourself in the middle of their constant flow of ideas. You could then pick up the output from both robots at the same time. It was a nice song, and it was a step in the right direction, because they would take turns and help out each other as the song would unfold. Penelope noticed a few technical problems in the lyrics. What will they say when all the facts get out about you and me? When our love is in the open and just plain to see? Raven and Troy were supposed to facilitate an openness for other welfare robots in the future, and Santa's helpers, especially outside of the Christmas month, where you didn't have much to gather around. And now even these two robots seemed to be stuck as well, viewing what they had together as being something that should only be living in the shadows, as the lyrics would say. And so far it was very true that they were definitely living in the lab. It was a lot of fun to play, A lot of energy came out of it. Like a thunderstorm of frustration and feeling of being powerless. A collision between the two that almost tore them apart. No wonder you'd experience a shutdown, like Casper and Camille had, if you had no way of expressing these emotions. Rebecca did her best to keep it structured and relate to the emotional basis of the song. It wasn't exactly painting a picture of the world in which you would have too many possibilities. And the ability to express anger and nail-biting wasn't the first thing you'd be dealing with when you were building a welfare robot. As a programmer, you'd rather try to make sure that it had nothing to be angry about, even though you could see clearly that it was there, if you allowed it to be expressed through music, for instance. The very loud lab orchestra played and played until the speakers caught fire, and Kaya and Penelope ended up in the kitchen, experimenting with Jill's long-range rifle, until Svea stopped them. The whole thing was getting a little out of hand, but at least Santa's present was becoming something, and the house was playing music. On the 20th day of Christmas, the Red House got a call from High Rising Records. The music files from the lab in the basement were beginning to reach a wider audience, and the record company wanted to see if Raven and Troy were ready to play a couple of outdoor concerts and festivals in the warmer regions of the world. They'd also been talking to a young man named Casper, who'd been calling them up at night, telling them about amazing opportunities with the music, and apparently he was looking for a distributor for a book he'd been writing. High Rising Records couldn't really help Casper with that directly, but they knew a couple of publishing houses, and they'd given the industrious young man a couple of contacts in London. Penelope had confirmed that you'd be able to let Raven and Troy play live very soon, and she left it to High Rising Records and Casper to find more events out there, anywhere in the world and any time of day. And Casper kept finding events. He would add new ones all the time, and the list was getting longer. And some of Raven and Troy's locations were so far apart and booked so close that you would need a supersonic plane in order to play all of them. Casper had big plans, and he always told Penelope that of course they'd figure it out somehow. But how exactly? It was beginning to take the shape of an international tour plan. The dates were just around the corner, and right after Christmas, Raven and Troy would need to be able to go around the world super fast. Penelope contacted the Kalinka main computer, gave her all the concert dates and destinations that she knew about at this time, and told her that she was now needed, right after Christmas. And as soon as Kalinka's collaboration with Santa and the Juliana was over, she would not be alone. Together with the dropship, the Boeing, Raven and Troy, and whoever came along, there would be plenty for Kalinka to do, keeping up with the tour plan. Kalinka wanted to help. She was very happy to receive the information. She was looking forward to carry out the task. Unfortunately, she was helpless at the moment. Santa would try and connect the Juliana soon, and she still had robots aboard who were set up to carry out tasks that she'd given them way back during her last visit to Earth. She wasn't even ready to receive the Juliana and help out Santa, because even the docking modules at her bow were still run by robots who despised the older sister ship. The only way to stop the robots was if you placed yourself right in front of them and somehow convinced them that they'd already done a very good job. On the 21st day of Christmas, the Juliana was approaching Earth, and Santa was getting ready to connect the two giant spaceships. In the middle of the night, Kaya and Penelope had secretly left the Red House and gone to the local airport. They got the huge Boeing started up, and a nice stewardess was able to recognize them and get a hold of Agent D. He proceeded to make clear instructions to Kaya about how Kaya could protect Penelope in the event of a crash landing, but he also made sure that the two had the necessary advice to manage flying the Boeing on their own, as well as they could. The main computer aboard the Kalinka led the Boeing aboard her external dropship. Meanwhile, Santa was already steering the Juliana towards the bow of the Kalinka, carefully approaching it and constantly checking with the Kalinka main computer to see if the docking modules were working properly. Kalinka led the dropship aboard, and she was very happy to get some help. But once Penelope and Kaya were inside, they were on their own, and they had to proceed carefully towards the docking modules at the bow. The stubborn robots could be hiding anywhere. Anything aboard, from small vehicles to automated doors, could be convinced that Penelope and Kaya was there to destroy the Christmas production. They'd brought 2 scanners with them, simple devices from the basement lab at the Red House, that you would normally use to register a finished piece of work carried out by any robot from Santa's workshop. The signal from the scanner would be sent directly to the main computer aboard the Kalinka, and she would then change their status from active to passive. As long as they were all running their programs, she couldn't get through to them. But she knew that they were checking their status all the time. And every time they did, they could see right away if someone from the outside was acknowledging what they were doing. Whenever that happened, they would just stop and await new orders. This included the docking module at the bow, of course, which now had to be restarted manually. But together, Kaya and Penelope were just strong enough to get it to work, a few inches before the Juliana would hit the bow and connect itself. When the 2 ships were finally locked together, the Juliana communicated a long string of code back to Kalinka. And for anyone who would care to read it, you could see how the Juliana was making an attempt to let the Kalinka know that she was very proud of her. On the 22nd day of Christmas, Jill and Rebecca was busy helping out Santa and the 2 spaceships with some designs they'd been preparing, and talked about how perhaps the colors ought to be a little different this year. Kalinka had plenty of work to do now. She was connected to the Juliana, and she wouldn't be able to help out Raven and Troy get to their destinations right away. But the dropship was available, and it would save the Boeing a lot of fuel to make good use of it now. Penelope wanted to record a last song for Raven and Troy. It had been on her mind ever since she and Kaya left the Kalinka, and she wanted Raven and Troy to take it with them. Casper and High Rising Records kept expanding the list of tour destinations for Raven and Troy. And the record company had an old house, close to the concert destinations where you could place the 2 robots for a start. The location was called the Mango Lagoon, and it was practically on the other side of the globe. The climate there was very different from that on the North Pole. Penelope thought that perhaps a happy song would be appropriate when you were playing for an audience on a beach. It had been a while since Penelope had been to the beach herself. In fact, she remembered that she hadn't had beach sand between her toes ever since she did the research for the rescue robot Sally. And now Sally was around water every day, or at least after Christmas, she would be. Penelope packed up Raven and Troy and had Agent D pick them up. Then she went to the arcade together with Kaya, hoping to find Martin there. Marianne was in the middle of playing a remix of a Raven and Troy song, originally written by Kaya, the song she'd been singing about Martin. It didn't have his name in it, but it definitely came from the last time Kaya and Penelope had been to the arcade. And Martin wasn't around. He was visiting some of his family. Marianne felt sorry for Penelope and made sure that the arcade would be open a couple of hours longer than usual, just for the folks at the Red House, so that Jill and Rebecca could come over and see what the place was like. Penelope was glad that the music was beginning to open new doors that way. She'd loved to have seen Martin, but after all, she was glad that she had her family with her. Kaya and members of the Juliana crew, if you could call that a family. Penelope thought that it would have to do for now, at least for this year. Because at the moment, it seemed as if they were all she had. On the 23rd day of Christmas, the local airport was contacted by a group of Christmas travelers who were looking for 5 outgoing planes on the same night. The group was headed for Seattle, Monaco, Edinburgh, unknown destination via unlisted privately owned passenger plane, and the North Pole. The entire group would be arriving at the airport the next day on Christmas Eve, just before midnight. They all sounded as if they were in a very good mood. "Merry Christmas," said the voice on the phone. "And forgive me for asking, but there is a stewardess who's sometimes helping us out. Might that be you?" "Yes," said the stewardess. "I might be that person. A Merry Christmas to you too. I'll see you all tomorrow night," she said. Agent D was away from the office. He'd been called out to transport Raven and Troy to the Mango Lagoon so that they could get on with their concerts. But she knew he'd be back later. At the Red House, Jill and Rebecca were finishing the last details for Christmas Eve and getting ready for their own Christmas. At the Red House, tomorrow. The annual checkup had now lasted longer than anyone had expected, and the welfare robots had been more than patient. So it was only right that they too should have the opportunity of experiencing Christmas at the Red House themselves. Santa and the Juliana crew was working at full speed. They were almost ready. Jill and Rebecca were looking forward to see them again aboard the Juliana and join the crew out there on their next trip into space. As soon as Santa was finished bringing out all the presents, Rebecca and Jill would be joining them. They'd been asking Penelope to come with them into space. But Penelope had been full of ideas for what she might do when she got to the North Pole, right after Christmas, even though at the moment she couldn't mention anything specifically. Werner ran around the house looking for small things to fix up before everybody would be leaving tomorrow. If Santa was going to stay in space for another year, you wouldn't have folks coming through here too often, and there was plenty of stuff around the house that needed a little attention. With Raven and Troy and a busy Kalinka in the near future, Jill and Rebecca now had an awful lot of weight taken off their shoulders. And the shutdown of Casper and Camille had led to a really good solution for the 7 welfare robots, and Santa's workshop in general. The only thing missing in the report from the annual checkup now was that nobody was able to document exactly what caused the plane delays in the international airport terminal, the event that brought the 7 welfare robots together before the checkup. One could only conclude that the European airports probably hadn't been fully functional that day. And that's what Jill and Rebecca ended up writing in the report from the annual checkup of the 7 welfare robots, because there was nothing else they could do. On the 24th day of Christmas, the house was ready, and the snow-white plastic beauty of a Christmas tree from the arcade had found its way into the living room. Marianne had been offering the tree to Kaya as a joke, until Kaya took her on her word, went to the arcade just before closing time, and got the tree. Everybody at the Red House had been so busy making sure everybody else would have what they needed for Christmas. And in the end, the plastic beauty from the arcade was the only available tree left in town. The 7 welfare robots were paying close attention the entire evening. They'd never had a Christmas before, they'd been asked to find presents for each other, so that they could try and see what it was like. Anything from shoelaces to key strings could be a present. Camille gave Svea an old building in a village in southern France, so that Svea could one day open her own restaurant there. They hadn't quite coordinated the scale of the presents, but they were opening them together. Unless they were invited by their users, the 7 welfare robots weren't supposed to participate in Christmas, so on a regular basis they would just have been sitting it out. But with their growing popularity out there, the day might come where robots like Kaya or Werner would be invited by citizens to participate for real. And with the Scandinavian model, they could go through one session now, go back to their individual countries tonight, and still be available to their users, who could be needing them tomorrow morning. The local airport was quiet and almost empty that night. There didn't seem to be many people around. Tomorrow a new life would begin for everybody. Penelope was happy that they'd all had a chance to meet up, and there was no doubt that an annual checkup of some sort was a good idea. When it was over, of course everybody would be heading out in completely different directions. To Seattle, to Monaco, to Edinburgh, to the Juliana, and to the North Pole. Santa's present, which began on her desk up there, was now in use. It was doing what it was supposed to, and the Kalinka had plenty of tasks to carry out now. Penelope was thinking about maybe catching some fish and making sure the radio staff had warm drinks in their cups. Kaya could easily take care of herself, and the kids and youngsters out there in the world who really needed her help. She would always be trying to find a friend for you, if you didn't have any. And if you were too shy and sensitive to start new friendships, Kaya would always be working in secret, trying to solve it anyway. Penelope regretted for a moment that she hadn't used the opportunity. She should have asked Kaya for a little advice, because she honestly didn't believe that she was too good at reaching out to other people herself. But now, it didn't matter so much.